Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second lecture for business writing. For this lecture, you should have read or skimmed Chapter 3 of the textbook covering understanding your audience, and you should have viewed the previous lecture as well on effective communication and effective writing. On this lecture, I want to really focus in on the first section of Chapter 3, which covers understanding yourself as fundamental to business communication. And I'm going to flesh out what's covered in that chapter with a little bit of information from a seminar I gave to a few business leaders back in 2018. So let me share my screen so we can get started. As you can see, this one will be a relatively brief lecture. So it's titled Understanding Your Audience, Understanding Yourself. As the textbook mentions, knowing who you are is just as important to communicating your message as understanding who the audience is. And I'll give you a way of coming at that problem in this lecture. So the seminar I mentioned a moment ago was titled Authentic Authorship, and the leaders and business people who participated were asked to do really three separate exercises. The first one was to write their professional life story in 3 episodes. The second was to write their personal life story in 3 episodes. And the last was to write their private life story in 3 episodes. And what this was meant to instill in them was the idea that we can tell our life stories in lots of different ways. And depending on what we want to present about ourselves, we're going to tell different stories about who we really are. And so because of that, we start to see that there's different types of authenticity, and I broke them down into 3 types. The first type is the traditional kind of authenticity, where you just say, hey, here's a list of attributes, and this is who I am. That's my authentic self. You can think about a certificate of authenticity for a work of art or something like that that just says, hey, I sign off on this. This is who I am. There's a romantic sense of authenticity, which is this idea that somewhere out there in the world or out in the metaphysical realm is who I am, and I've just got to live life and discover it. And lastly, there's the existential type of authenticity, which is to say, I kind of discover who I am through my actions every day. And so at the end of that seminar, and what I'll present to you now, is we came to really 4 characteristics of authentic authors. First, they develop stories and anticipate counter stories. That means they're always thinking about who they are, about what they are, and what they want to accomplish, and are always telling themselves that story. And they anticipate counter stories, right? For every story I understand about myself or the world, there are probably thousands of different ways of looking at it. And so we anticipate those and understand that people are just going to understand events differently based on who they are and where they're coming from. Secondly, we said they observe and acknowledge the rhythms of their lives. We talked about the rhetorical situation a little bit in the last lecture, and I'll return to it in this one. But your message is going to change based on where you are in life. Are you stressed on a particular day, or are you going through a rough time in life? These are going to change how you can fundamentally communicate in a business context, and you need to be able to observe them and acknowledge that they're just as important as the knowledge that you have. Next, they center choice and reflection in their decision-making, which means we don't kind of just wander into decisions. We don't, authentic authors don't just wander into a situation and say, oh, I'll say what I say when I get there. They reflect, they think about the choices they're going to make, and then they start communication from a place of empowerment, really, by doing so. Lastly, they embody their stories, decisions, and reflections in all that they do. So I mentioned last time about the responsibility to an employer, the responsibility to yourself, the responsibility to your profession. And here again, you have to think about that. When I communicate something, am I really embodying that? Am I being the type of engineer, for example, that I say that I am? Or am I being the type of marketer that I said I was going to be? And so these are all parts of being an authentic author. But there's one sort of big problem with this framework. And it comes from Daniel Kahneman, who wrote the book Thinking Fast and Slow, which was more or less a study in behavioral economics. And he found that we know far less about ourselves than we feel we do, which is why in the seminar I mentioned, I centered really telling your story to yourself over and over and telling yourself your story in different contexts. But let's kind of generalize this, right? Because if we know less about ourselves than we feel we do, then you know that you don't really know a lot about your receiver, your message, your channel, your environment, and your context. So when we think about a piece of business communication, we have to think about our receiver, and they're going to have as many different stories about themselves as we have about ourselves. And how can we tap into those stories? How can we understand where they're coming from on a professional level, on a personal level, or even a private level? How much do you really know about your message? Have you taken the time to break apart the words you're using, to think about what biases might be in them, to really understand where those words came from and how they might affect an audience? These are questions you should ask. Next, how much do you know about your channel? Think about tweeting something, for example. How much do you really know about the algorithms of Twitter? How much do you really know about how that message is going to get disseminated to the audience you want to reach? These are things you should think about and should consider in business contexts. I mentioned last time about the environment as piece of the rhetorical situation, and it's something I wanted to bring back up now. How much do we really know about our physical environment? How much do we know about the back room? Excuse me. How much do we really know about the background of a classroom, for example, or the background of a boardroom? And does that really matter? It might not, but it's worth considering. And lastly, how much do we know about the context? Obviously, you can't know everything about the relationships between and among people, the relationships between and among institutions, but you should do your best to really understand what is the context, what are the relationships at play here, and how can I either leverage them for my gain, or how can I avoid any potential conflicts? And so that's going to be our brief lecture for this time. In the corresponding assignment, I've asked you to do a self-profile. In the syllabus, I tied it to netiquette and your online conduct. But I think when you go and read the syllabus sheet, or I'm sorry, excuse me, when you read the assignment sheet, I'm going to broaden that out a little bit for more ways of thinking about who you are and maybe what kind of product could be sold to someone who is like you or who matches your description. So that's all for the second lecture. Thanks for your time.